Welcome back to another Bible study with me. Today we're going to go into Matthew chapter 2 and look into that for a while. But also I want to remind you to hit the subscribe button because I'm going to be putting out a video every single day on the Gospel of Matthew because we're going to go through every single chapter and you definitely don't want to miss it. Also, by the way, I'm still sick. I've been sick for like a week. I don't know why, but I just have this horrible cold. And it's not really cool, but whatever. We're gonna push through it and go through the Gospel of Matthew. So, also, I want to show you a cool picture. Look at this picture. It's like pretty cool. See, isn't that like a really cool picture? I thought so. Maybe you think so too. I don't know. Let me know in the comments below. So let's go ahead and jump into the text. This is Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. That's the first portion of text we're going to look at. We're going to look at both sections, but this is just the first part of the first chapter, and it's really cool. So if you look here, it says after Jesus was born. I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. It basically says, starting in verse 2, it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, that's Herod the Great, by the way, the Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Then Herod the Great heard this and was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem, in Judea, they said, for this is what the prophet has written. And on your screen here, I put the text here of this quotation on the left-hand side of the screen, so I can fit all of the rest of the passage in here. But it says, "But to you, Bethlehem, the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Starting over here in verse 7, it says, "Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him.' After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it arose went ahead of them until it stopped over a place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary. And they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." So, first of all, before we go crazy off into this passage, let me tell you something. This video is going to get tough. It's going to get tough real quick. It's going to be real rough around the edges. Because again, what we're doing in this series is we have a particular lens that we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew. In other words, we're not going in here to tell you about some parables or tell you about some stories or help you memorize stuff or make a good Sunday morning sermon or make you feel good or try and teach you some spiritual principles. That's not what we're doing in this series, okay? What we're doing in this series is we are trying to understand it in context. And by that, I mean this. We are looking for the author's intention. In other words, whoever wrote Matthew, we are looking for what that person originally wrote. And if you did not watch the first video on chapter 1 that I did, I'll bring you up to date. The lens that we're going with is very simple. There are 3 facts that we have established. Number 1, Matthew the tax collector did not write the Gospel of Matthew. Number 2, the Gospel of Matthew was written in 80 to 85 AD, not 50 AD. And number 3, it is a Gentile gospel, not a Jewish gospel. Now, obviously, I said, if you have not watched that video, you should go and watch it. It'll bring you up to date a lot better. But in that video, I basically said, look, if you go to church or you spent most of your life in church, what you've heard is the opposite of that. What you've heard is that Matthew, the tax collector, is the author of Matthew's gospel, that it was written in 50 AD, not 80, 85 AD, and that's written to Jews, not Gentiles. So it's basically the opposite. And so the question is, why am I teaching you something that you're not being taught in church? And well, I answered it in the first one, and I'll answer it now. Number one, we're not in church, and number two, I'm not your pastor. Basically, that means I get to do what I want. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm doing what I want. The most important thing is this, though. Knowledge is power. And in order to get knowledge, you have to learn stuff that you don't know. That's how you get knowledge. And most people don't know about this stuff. Most people don't know about what scholars are talking about. Most people don't know anything really about any type of scholarship on the New Testament or on the Gospel of Matthew. And so what I'm trying to do is open up those doors to people and sort of take ordinary church people and expose them to stuff that scholars have talked about for a long time. In the first video we did in chapter 1, we talked about 3 big problems in the text, and I called them mistakes, I called them errors, I'm sure lots of people were upset about that, but all I did was just point out some stuff that scholars talked about. There's a miscounting in the genealogy. Matthew confuses the term engagement and marriage, and he misquotes Isaiah chapter 7. Those are pretty much the biggest problems there. And when we come here and look at this passage, what we see is something, we basically see a continuation. Also, I mentioned this is why we're using the lens that we're using, because as we're going through this gospel, what we're purposely looking for are mistakes or errors or contradictions or problems or whatever. We're purposely looking for those things. Not so we can say that the Bible's hopelessly flawed and, go down that crazy, insane, stupid road. What we're doing is we're trying to understand these mistakes in the context of them purposely being there. It's a very strange way to do it, but again, knowledge is power. And so what we're doing here is we're learning new things. Okay, because look, here's the thing. When you get out into the real world, when you get away from your little church, you get away from your little Bible study, and you get out in the real world, and you start talking to real people who have real information, who really know what they're talking about, let me tell you something, you're going to get absolutely murdered. Okay, when you take this crap that you've learned from church and you bring it out into the real world, you're going to get slaughtered. Okay, you're like, if you have any sense at all, you're going to be highly embarrassed. You're going to be humiliated. Because the information that you've been told in church, I'm sorry, just to say it outright, the information you've been told in church is just not necessarily good information. And so what I'm trying to do is give you more information, give you different answers, give you different explanations, and sort of try to update some of the stuff that the church has not updated yet. Trying to open your brain up to other things. Because once again, when you get out in the real world and you start talking to real people who really know what they're talking about, who really study the Bible, like, you're going to get crucified, you're going to get murdered, you're going to be absolutely humiliated because you think you know what you're talking about because some pastor told you that this stuff's true and basically told you to repeat it to someone else for some type of evangelistic purposes. And, what you're going to find out real quick is that the world's vicious, and it does not care, and it will swallow you whole. It will swallow you whole, and if you're not ready for that, you're it's like a sheep being led to the slaughter. And what I'm trying to help you learn here is how to not be led to the slaughter. I'm trying to give you a lot of information so you can go study it more for yourself, and so you're able to be better prepared to handle some of these real life situations. It's definitely a different approach, but you got to understand, there are lots of people out there who really know a lot of information about the Bible. They know a lot of stuff about the Bible, and you probably don't know as much as they do. And this doesn't have anything to do with beliefs. I mean, we could be talking about Christians here, right? I mean, there are some really smart Christians out there who know a lot of stuff about the Bible, and then there are lots of Christians who don't know a whole lot about the Bible. And you stick those two people in a room, and it's a bloodbath. And let me tell you something, you do not want to be the person who doesn't know a whole lot. You want to be the person who knows as much as possible, or at least you know enough to keep your mouth shut, put it that way. You don't want to go walking into a trap. That's what I'm trying to tell you. So the lens we're looking at here is very much different than what you're going to get in church, and we're purposely doing it not to disprove the Bible, but to open your brain up, open your mind up to like lots of other stuff you've never thought about, stuff that your church isn't talking about, stuff your Bible study's not talking about, stuff that anybody else you know is talking about. We're trying to open up your mind to new things and expose you to new things in a very Christian way, of course, and really expand your brain. So the first thing that we have to realize here about this passage is I mentioned Herod the Great. When I read it to you, I talked about Herod the Great. And this is very important to understand for a number of different reasons. And also, it's very important to understand some stuff about problems, okay? Because again, when you go to church, you're told, well, there's no problems in the Bible. Well, the problem with that idea is that when you come across a problem in the Bible, because you believe that there's no problems, then therefore there is no problems. And so when you read passages like this on your screen, you don't see the problem. And this is what I'm trying to help you with. I'm trying to help you realize that there are problems. Okay, now problems doesn't mean that it's hopelessly flawed and you got to throw your Bible away and stop being a Christian. That's not what that means. It just means there's problems. Okay, and this, what you're looking at on your screen, is a problem. And the problem that we're looking at here, that of course most people don't know about, is this idea of Herod, and basically he tries to go and find Jesus. And the question we have to, it's a historical problem. And so we really have to ask this question, did this stuff really happen? And this is a very interesting question, and it's not easy to answer. It's not easy to answer for lots of reasons. King Herod was, first of all, let's just go over some simple stuff, because we don't have time to go into all this stuff, because then we'll be here for like 4 hours. But basically, King Herod was a real person, and not only was he a real person, but he was king of Judea. Okay, and we basically get all this information from Josephus, and this is where history sort of has, it does that, it kind of collides. Because in order to date history, lots of times what we try to do or hope for is to have 2 or 3, 4 independent sources that tell us the same story. And when you have 2 or 3 or 4 different independent sources telling you the same story, it's probably true. And most of the time there's discrepancies in those accounts, but for the gist of it's there. Well, when it comes to King Herod, all we have is pretty much Josephus and a little bit in Matthew's gospel. And the problem is that Josephus tells us a lot about Herod being like a violent man and stuff. And the Gospel of Matthew very much shows this same thing. As we'll see later on in this passage, what Herod does is he goes to find this Messiah. He finds the Messiah, Jesus, and then he says, well, you know what? We got to kill this king. And so he goes and has all the babies killed. And so the question really is this a real story? Not necessarily just did Herod have the babies killed, but the entire thing. And I haven't shown you the whole chapter yet, but we'll see later on here that pretty much all of chapter 2 of Matthew's gospel is talking about Herod. And so, and I know I'm going like way off the map here, and people are starting to get like scared in their seats, and they're like, "Oh my God, you're talking crazy nonsense stuff." It's like, bro, hold on a second. We're not talking theology, we're talking history, and they're not the same thing. Okay, so you need to hold on and get your facts straight, and not get all crazy and oh my gosh. There's history and then there's theology, and they are not the same thing. Okay. And this is what's hard to understand about the Bible, but it's also something that I'm trying to teach you, because if you don't understand this, and if you're not willing to learn it, you're never going to understand anything about the Bible, particularly the Gospels, because what's interesting about the Gospels is that they definitely go off the map a little bit. In other words, they don't actually tell us real history in certain instances because they have a theological point. And sometimes they have, sometimes it's the other way around. I'll give you a really good example. The Gospel of John, for example, it paints Jesus going around saying, I am this, I am that, I am this. Before Abraham and Isaac, I am. Okay, he's basically saying that he's God. Well, the problem is that when you think about that historically and you ask the question, did Jesus really go around saying these things, like word for word actually saying these things? As a historian, you have no choice but to say, no, he didn't, because it would have been impossible for him to say these things word for word. And so the question then becomes, what is the Gospel of John actually trying to do? And when you go that route, what you realize is that when John wrote his Gospel, he's not writing to tell us a historical account. He's writing to tell us a theological account. Okay, so John's Gospel, whoever wrote John's Gospel, his authorial intent, the intent of the author, keep in mind that's the same thing we're trying to do here with Matthew's Gospel, find the author's intention. John is writing theology, so he's actually doing an interpolation. In other words, he looked at these other gospel accounts and he said, well, look, they have the history down, they have this down, they have that down, but they didn't focus enough on Christology, which Christology is the study of Christ. And basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to interpolate, not interpret, but interpolate. It basically means I'm going to tell you a story, and as I'm telling you the story, I'm telling you my interpretation of that story. Okay, so you're not actually changing the story necessarily, but what you're doing is you're giving the interpretation of the story as you're telling it. That's interpolation. That's basically what the Gospel of John is. So is the Gospel of John a historical account? That question is very difficult to answer. But a better question to ask is, was it intended to be a historical account? And the answer to that question is no, it wasn't. So when we flip back over here to Matthew chapter 2, we ask the same question. Did Matthew intend this to be historical? And as I've said before, with some other problems in chapter 1, Matthew is an illustrative writer. Okay, his gospel's different from Mark, and his gospel's different from Luke, and he's a very illustrative writer. That's why you have a lot of parables and you have a lot of stories. And so basically what he's trying to do is illustrate a point. And so that sort of gives him the ability to talk about fake history, if you will, or history that didn't happen, so he can illustrate a point. We know from chapter 1 that Matthew is very much focused on Jesus being the Messiah. And so he's continuing this narrative of Jesus' life. And what he's doing with this narrative of Jesus' life is he's centering it around King Herod, because King Herod is the king of the Jews. Well, how's Jesus killed? Jesus is killed as king of the Jews. And so it sort of follows this type of logic where there's this hierarchy of needs. And so what we also see here is that Matthew definitely knows about King Herod, and he's writing about 85 AD, but he knows a lot about King Herod. So he must have read sources of something, about King Herod, or at least knew of the traditions, because Jews did not like King Herod. They were not a fan of the guy, because he was a very bad king. He basically hated the Jews. He treated them very poorly. Again, we don't have time to go into all that stuff, but you can go search Herod the Great, and you can go learn all you need to know about him. And so it's when you understand Herod and you understand what Matthew is talking about here, what you see is that he knew about King Herod and knew a lot of information about him. But does that mean that this story that he's telling here is correct? And the answer to the question is, we don't know. That's just the simple answer, we don't know. But the good news for us is that it actually doesn't matter. Okay? It actually does not matter. I know lots of people think it matters, but it doesn't matter. Also, when we come down here to the rest of the passage, this is verses 13 to 23. There's a quotation in here, and I put it over here on the right-hand side so you can see. But when we look at this passage, it tells us the rest of the story, if you will. It says, when he had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for you and kill him." So he got up and took the child and his mother during the night and left and went to Egypt. And so he stayed until the death of Herod, okay? And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted, this statement right here is like pretty telling. This is like, these are the types of statements that we're looking for. This is when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. But the problem is that it said that he's already dead. Okay? We see what Matthew's doing. It's very interesting. Anyways, he says, and he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem, and yada yada. Okay, so let me just stop. First of all, let's talk about something. I mentioned this to you before. It's about Moses, right? The story of Moses is very simple. Moses is in Egypt, and he leaves Egypt and he murders somebody in Egypt, and then he goes off to the wilderness, and he's in the wilderness, and then God shows up and says, I am that I am. And then Moses is called back to Egypt to set the people free. He goes and gets the Israelites, and then he brings them back to the Promised Land. Okay? Now, obviously what we see here with Jesus is the same exact thing. Jesus goes down to Egypt, and he goes back to the Promised Land. Okay? And so, why? Well, because Matthew is appealing to authority. So, if he's prophesied by Isaiah, and he is, very similar to Moses, or very similar to the story of Moses, then therefore this is a credible story. Okay, so that's sort of the logic that's being used here. It's very important to understand that type of logic. He's not just making this stuff up. Also, I want to make this very important when it comes to history. This is where lots of people, particularly Christians in church, get it all mixed up. Because what they think history is witness. Okay, and let me be very clear about this. History is not witness. Okay, and what I mean by witness is people think, well, if there's one eyewitness and that eyewitness sees that event happen, and therefore it's historical fact. That's not true. What if the witness lied? What if they're not telling the truth? What if they made it up? What if they forgot something? What if they exchanged memories? What if? Stuff that we know that happens with humans, and humans in memory, and humans with lying, and so on and so forth. Okay, if you're going to read the Bible historically, which of course you have to do if you're going to read in context and do an exegesis and do all that stuff that your church likes to talk about. If you're going to do all that stuff, then you have to ask critical questions, and you have to ask the question of eyewitness. What does it mean to be an eyewitness? What does it mean when we say there's an eyewitness? What does that actually mean? And if there is an eyewitness, is it a credible eyewitness? What exactly do we mean by a credible eyewitness? These are questions you have to ask. They're very critical questions, and you have to ask them and you have to understand them. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go into all those answers. We'll get into them later on down the road. But basically, it's really simple. Witnesses are people who apparently saw it. Okay? And if you look here on your screen, here's something very interesting. It says, when he had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up. Okay? Well, we're asking the question about witnesses. So in other words, in order for something to be true, there had to be somebody to see it. Okay? So the question is, who saw Joseph have this dream? Okay? Where did this tradition come from? And what I'm trying to explain to you is that we have a problem of witness. When you read about these conversations here, and it says, talks about Herod and the Magi having these conversations, and he summons them, and the question is, how do the people know this? Who saw this happen? Okay, who saw this stuff happen? And the answer is very simple. We don't know. We don't even know if anybody saw it, and chances are, unfortunately, nobody saw it. Because it would be very hard for somebody to sneak into a temple and listen in on Herod's secret conversations. That would be like, if you're going to make that argument, it would be like you saying that the president of the United States is having a conversation with somebody right now, and you're watching it happen. Well, that's not, you just an ordinary person on the internet or whatever. the chances of that being, that's just not going to happen. In other words, whatever the president is talking about, or whatever, those government people are talking about, is in confidence. It's secret. Ordinary people don't have access to it. It's classified. It's private conversations. And so that's what we're seeing here with Herod in these types of conversations. We're seeing private conversations happen in the temple courts, and so who saw these conversations happen? Who witnessed? And I know this is where the Christian conspiracies come out, and it's all kinds of crazy. Well, maybe it was a servant, and a servant was a secret believer, and he told this, and he told that. It's like, dude, do you have any idea how absolutely insane that is to say something like that? I mean, that's absolutely insane, because we're talking the birth of Jesus here. So you're saying that the birth of Jesus? No, I'm sorry, that just does not add up. So what I'm trying to say is that there's really no credible witnesses for this stuff, and so given that there's no witnesses. We haven't gotten to the question of credible witnesses. We're just asking, is there witnesses? Are there witnesses who see this happen? Is there a witness who sees this conversation between Herod and the Magi? Is there a witness who sees this dream, or knows Joseph who knows this dream? It can't be the disciples, because the disciples aren't even around yet. I mean, this is the birth of Jesus. This is 4 or 5 BC. Right? So the disciples aren't around yet. So there's no followers of Jesus. There's no John the Baptist. There's no one in the Christian movement. There's no witnesses to this thing. All we have is this story. And you understand what I'm trying to say? Who is the witness? Who is witnessing this event? And the answer is we don't know. And furthermore, we could probably say that there is no witness. That might be considered a radical position by some people. They say, well, just because it doesn't say, whatever. I'm just saying that it is very plausible to believe that there was no witness. And so if there was no witness, that means this can't necessarily be true historically. And so this proposes a little bit of a problem, I guess you could say. And again, I know this is heavy stuff, and it's very tough, and it's, kind of just punch you in the face. But listen, we're not going over the study and talking about this information so you can walk out of here and say, oh my God, the Bible's hopelessly flawed. That guy's a skeptic. It isn't, that's not what we're doing. Okay, what I'm telling you is that if you're not willing to learn new things, you're not going to gain knowledge. Okay? And in order to learn new things, you're going to have to learn things that don't necessarily fit in line with your beliefs. And if you spent your whole life in church and you've listened to pastors in church talk about this stuff and so on and so forth, what you know is that you've probably never heard anything like this before. Also, when you get out into the real world and you start dealing with real people who really know stuff about the Bible, stuff that I'm telling you right now. By the way, this is the light version. This is the easy version. This is the survey, right? This isn't the heavy stuff. This is the survey. It's heavy for you probably, but it's the survey. It's the introduction into it. It's like, hey, this is just surface level stuff. It's nothing major. It's nothing really that big to worry about. But when you get out there with the big dogs who really know what they're talking about, dude, it's vicious. And so for people who are not aware of this stuff, people, for example, you might be a person who this is the first time you've ever heard somebody say that there's something in the Bible that's not historical, that Joseph actually didn't have a dream, that this conversation between Herod and the Magi probably didn't happen because there was no witness. This is probably the first time you've ever heard this before. And I understand it's a shock, and you're taken aback, and you're like, whoa, this is crazy. What do I do? But let me just make this point very clear. What I'm telling you is the introduction. Okay, this is when you're talking about exegesis and you're talking about context and you're talking about author intention, these are the types of things that you look at. When you want to exegete a passage, these are the types of things you think about. This is how you exegete a passage. I know it's very bizarre because, we don't teach this stuff in church, but this is what an exegesis is. These are the types of things you think about. These are the types of things, these are the types of problems that you handle when you do an exegesis of the passage. And so I'm exposing you to some exegetical work and some contextual work and historical work and theological work and some other stuff like that. But I'm also trying to expose you to the other side of biblical scholarship, which is the vicious side, the side where if you take some of the stuff that you've learned in church into the real world, where people really know stuff about the Bible, dude, I I mean, if you have any confidence in what your church has told you, you won't anymore. In other words, if you think that what I'm telling you is harsh, like you have no idea how harsh the real world is. If you think that what I'm telling you is skeptical, you have no idea how skeptical the world is. This is on a scale of like 1 to 10. This is like level 1. -1, actually. It's not even a 0 yet. It doesn't even come up on the level yet. This is like, it's not even that big of a deal. It's just normal stuff, really. But to some of you, it might be like, wow, that's just, mind-blowing. You don't know what to do. You sort of feel a little bit awkward. And that's okay. I'm just telling you, there's lots of stuff about the Bible that you probably don't know about. There's lots of stuff your churches aren't talking about. There's lots of stuff your pastors aren't talking about. There's lots of stuff your Bible study leaders are not talking about. Your Christian friends are not talking about. And I'm just trying to open your mind up to new things. And they're really not new things. These are things that scholars have been talking about for centuries. It's nothing. I mean, this is, like I said, it's like a survey. It's not even really an introduction. It's just a survey. It's like hey, this is stuff that we've known for a long time, and it's nothing crazy. And my reason for telling you is to, number 1, prepare you. Number 2, help you understand the Bible a lot better. Because again, what a lot of times authors do in the Bible is they don't actually tell you real history. Sometimes they make history up. We see this in the book of Acts, for example. Evangelical scholars have come to call the book of Acts theological history. And what they mean by that term is it's theology and it's history that's been changed. Okay? So, for example, the speech of Stephen. If you're familiar with the book of Acts, then you know something about the speech of Stephen. Basically, it's this long, drawn-out speech. He sees the heaven open up, and, he has this long, drawn speech out, okay? And a historian comes in and asks the question, well, is this really the full speech of Stephen? Because it's literally it's like a real speech that goes on forever. And so the question, our historian is going to ask the question, does that mean that somebody was there writing this speech? Because we know that if he gave the speech, you wouldn't memorize it. It would be like you watching this video for the first time and memorizing everything that I just said and then writing it down and then or teaching it to somebody else who taught it to someone else who taught it to someone else and then eventually wrote it down. You understand what I'm trying to say? So historians realize, wait a second, the speech that Stephen gave, and probably lots of the other speeches as well, were not recorded word for word. There was nobody there writing it down, and there was nobody there who actually remembered the speeches. Maybe they remembered certain parts of it, but they didn't memorize the whole speech as we have them today. So what does that mean? Well, it means that somebody had they understood the theology, and so what they did is they took the theology and they used characters. So in these characters, just because you use the word character does not mean that they're not a real person. So Stephen, for example, is a real person, but he's also a character in the story of the book of Acts. And so the author of Acts has a theology that he wants to teach. Well, the way that he teaches that theology is through the character Stephen. So in other words, instead of Luke saying, hey, here's this theology, he uses Stephen to give a speech, and that speech itself is the theology. Okay? It's a little bit complicated to understand, but it's how you have to understand it because that's the way it was written. So did Stephen actually give a real speech? Probably. He probably did give a real speech. But is the speech that we read in the book of Acts the actual speech that he gave? Probably not. No, probably no. It's not word for word. That's for sure. Maybe the theological concept was there, and the other people just filled it in over the years. That may have happened. It's not a real speech. And so, likewise, we kind of see this Matthew doing a very similar thing with the story of Herod. Is there anybody who actually saw this event happen with Herod and the Magi, this conversation take place? No. Did anybody see Joseph have a dream, or was this dream passed down through tradition? Probably not. I mean, it may have been, but not very likely. I mean, based on how you can read Matthew's gospel in a way where it actually makes more sense for him to sort of, I don't want to say make history up, but I want to say change history a little bit for theology. Then you begin to understand Matthew's gospel. And I think from Matthew's perspective when he originally wrote his gospel, I don't think that he had in mind to write real history, verbatim. I think his goal was to focus more on theology. And we see that through his claims, which is that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is Messiah, Jesus is Messiah, prophesied by Isaiah. That's what we see. We see this divine orchestration going on, and this divine element that we see is very good evidence to suggest that he's not telling us history as it actually is, but he's telling us history in a way where it is slightly altered, if you will. Slightly altered, if you will. I don't think that's a good way to put it, but for now, that's just what we're going to say, because we're obviously running out of time. This has been in this video for a while. So when you read this passage, and I highly encourage you to do it, read it on your own. But when you read this passage, you need to be thinking about these conversations. Did this conversation actually take place? Where are the witnesses? Are there witnesses? Does this text say anything about witnesses? Is there a way in which we could explain where maybe a witness was there? Are we able to do this in this passage? And the answer, pretty much from my perspective, is I don't know. That's up for you to decide. Because what I believe is I believe that that interpretation, Bible interpretation, is best done in community, which is why I'm making these videos and why I want you guys to comment. I don't want you just to comment and say that you disagree. I want you to comment and tell me why you disagree. And also, I'm not offering my interpretation, and I'm not. If I were offering my interpretation, I would not be offering it as some type of authoritative, this is how it is, you have to believe it this way. What I like to do is put views out there and say, hey, what about this? What about that? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Because it's the community, it's the Christian community that comes together and says, here's what we think. And through that, answers are established, answers are developed. And so I highly encourage you guys to go down into the comments and type anything that you learned. Tell me what you've learned. Tell me if I've exposed you to anything new. If you've never thought about this before. If this is the first time you've ever heard about witnesses being in the text or not in the text. If you've ever thought about what a witness actually is, how we can know whether or not witnesses are credible. If it's the first time you ever learned about exegesis or an eisegesis or context or authorial intent, author intention, or history or theology or whatever it is, anything that I said in here. Don't be afraid to comment. Like, literally go down and write a comment and tell me what you learned. Tell me what you think. It's very important. Interpretation is done in community. And so what you have to understand is that on my channel, there is no right or wrong answer. I don't care about being right. I don't care about being wrong. What I care about is the information. I care about the conversation. I care about the community. And so I'm trying to create a channel where the community is open. And everybody's open-minded, nobody's closed-minded, and we're open to people's opinion. And so I want you to comment below and be honest. And know that, like, when you come here to this channel, it's okay to talk about skepticism or heresy, if you will. It's okay to express views that you might not be able to express in your church or your Bible study or something like that. Really just open up your mind, because that's what you have to do. You have to jump over that barrier and realize that if you don't get away from the church lingo for a little bit and step back and say, wait a second, I need to be a little bit more critical in my thought, you're not really going to understand a lot of the Bible. Eventually, you're going to hit a dead-end street, and you're going to get spiritually dry, and you're going to go into a desert. It's not going to be good. So you have to open up your mind. You have to really be open to many, many, many different things, and that's always best done in community. Because you may read a passage 100 times and have the same interpretation every time you read it, but somebody else is going to come along and read that passage and say, well, maybe it means this, maybe it means that. They're going to challenge you, and they're going to open up your brain. And so that's the best way to interpret the Bible is through community. And that's what I'm promoting through my channel. That's what I'm promoting with all these videos. That's another reason why I'm making videos. And so if you want to know more videos and you want to join the community and help build this community and be productive, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And again, I'll be putting out a new video every single day. And be going over the Gospel of Matthew. Tomorrow we'll be in chapter 3. It's going to be super awesome. It's going to be super great. And I hope to see you there. And I hope you subscribe. And I hope you like being here on the channel. And I hope you like what I'm doing. As always, I'll see you in the next video. If you like this video and want to know more, you can hit the subscribe button for more videos. If you have a question or a comment, or maybe you just like to say something or express your opinion, go ahead and comment that below. And like the video if you like the video, because liking the video is always a good thing when you like the video. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and you can find out more about me if you like at my website, adamjordanclark.com. And as always, I will see you in the next video.